One of the most horrific sites of slaughter during the Second World War was Bergen-Belsen Concentration Camp. At the end of the war, thousands of prisoners were sent to the camp from other sites such as Auschwitz, being taken there on death marches led by former guards. Inside of Belsen, the conditions of the camp became horrific, and people collapsed and died, and their corpses were just left. There was little to no food administered, but even in the dying days of the war in Europe, there were SS guards who remained at Belsen to allegedly keep order. When the British and Canadian soldiers arrived on the 15th of April 1945 to liberate Belsen, they came across 60,000 starving and disease-ridden prisoners, but 13,000 corpses lying all around the camp. The guards had not even bothered to bury the sheer amount of bodies of those who had suffered, and people were dying at a rate of 500 every day. But amongst the prisoners were guards, and some were hiding out. Many of the female guards who remained were ordered to help clean up the camp, but they also were later brought to trial. Some were not, and managed to escape any form of punishment at all. In this video, we look at the varying fates of the female guards of Bergen-Belsen Concentration Camp. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. As the liberators arrived at Bergen-Belsen, there was a huge clean-up operation needed. Typhus and other diseases were running rampant throughout the camp, and the 13,000 unburied bodies needed to be dealt with. The British and Canadian forces did not have sufficient manpower to bury the bodies on their own, so the arrested female guards, along with their male counterparts, were ordered to get involved. The women were specifically involved in dealing with 5,000 bodies inside of mass grave number 2. They were ordered to dig this huge pit by hand, and the former guards, women such as Herta Bofa, Anneliese Coleman, Elisabeth Volkenrath and others, were told to gather up the corpses of the former prisoners. They found that some of the bodies were so rotten that arms and legs came away, as they then tried to lift them onto the trucks, and these trucks were then taken over to mass grave number 2, and the bodies were then thrown in rather unceremoniously by the female guards. The women were given no protective clothing, and they were constantly shouted and screamed at to continue working hard. They were also given starvation rations to punish them, and these women were seen by the liberators as the ultimate evil. Within months, 17 former members of Belsen's guard force had died as they contracted typhus from handling the bodies of those who had died. Many of the women who worked at Bergen-Belsen had arrived from other camps such as Auschwitz, Ravensbrück and other sites. Many places had been evacuated due to the threat of the Germans' enemies on the horizon, and death marches were ordered, and the women guards went with them. This is why guards such as Irma Grazer, Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann were sent to Bergen-Belsen, and they made a decision to remain inside of the camp in the final days of the Second World War. It's not known why they didn't try and flee like other guards. Presumably they were so power-hungry that they wanted to continue instigating punishment and torture over the sufferers, but they claimed that they wanted to maintain law and order. One woman who would not, at the end of the Second World War, escape punishment was the beautiful beast Irma Grazer, a young guard in her 20s, known for her striking blonde hair but her brutal demeanour. Grazer was offered the chance to leave Belsen by Commandant Josef Kramer, and he was going to transfer her away, but she wanted to remain with her boyfriend, Franz Hatzinger. This decision probably cost her her life, and she may have escaped any punishment if she had fled. Now, the female guards of Belsen had varying fates following the clean-up of the camp. Some, as mentioned, left the camp and fled days before the liberators arrived, as they knew what was coming on the horizon. One example of this was the former head overseer, Rapportführerin, Hildegard Golosch. She was one woman who escaped any form of punishment, and it's known that she disappeared roughly on the 9th of April 1945, just under a week before liberation. Her whereabouts and what happened to her has never been documented, and it's not known what happened to her. Presumably she managed to live out the rest of her life in relative comfort, putting her former role as a senior guard at Bergen-Belsen behind her, and there were no searches documented for Hildegard Golosch launched. Most of the female guards who were arrested upon liberation were later brought to the Belsen trials. This legal proceeding dealt with the men and women who worked at the site and who had been captured, and those who had worked at Auschwitz and other camps. The first trial saw 16 female guards on trial, and this included Elisabeth Volkenrath, an Oberaufseherin or head warden, Irma Grazer, Johanna Bormann, who was known as the woman with the dogs ominously, Herta Ellert, Ilse Forster, Herta Bofer, Irene Haschka, Gertrude Sauer, Anna Hempel, Gertrude Feist, Frieda Wolter, Hilda Lissewitz, Ida Forster, Clara Opitz, Charlotte Klein, and Hildegard Harnell. They were accused of crimes at Auschwitz and also crimes at Bergen-Belsen, and the courtroom heard of their actions of many of the women and what they'd done. For example, Charlotte Klein, a woman who admitted striking prisoners who took bread, was asked many questions by the prosecution to try and get her to implicate the other women. There were 3 women who were sentenced to death during the Belsen trials. These were Irma Grazer, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. Now, what made these women stand out with regards to their punishment was the fact they had all worked inside of Auschwitz. They were found guilty of both committing crimes at Belsen and Auschwitz, and they were known to have been involved in the selections of prisoners who were then sent to the gas chambers. These 3 women, without doubt, had participated in the slaughter of thousands. The guards who were not condemned were not those who worked at Auschwitz, and the real dividing factor in what sent women to their deaths was the crimes they committed inside of Auschwitz. These women were executed on the 13th of December 1945 inside the execution chamber of Hamelin Prison. Experienced British executioner Albert Pierpoint met with the condemned days before their deaths to calculate their height and weight, and also the drop needed to snap their necks as they went through the gallows. He executed the women first that morning, and they were condemned on the gallows on their own. Pierpoint later said regarding Irma Grazer's execution that, "We climbed the stairs to the cells where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door, leading to the corridor, flung open the door, and we filed past the row of faces and into the execution chamber. The officers stood at attention. Brigadier Patton Walsh stood with his watch raised. He gave me the signal, and a sigh of released breath was audible in the chamber. I walked into the corridor. Irma Grazer, I called. The German guards quickly closed all the grills on 12 of the inspection holes and opened one door. Irma Grazer stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside, and I had to pinion her in the corridor. Follow me, I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. At 9:34 a.m, she walked into the execution chamber, gazed for a moment at the officials standing round it, then walked onto the centre of the trap, where I had made a chalk mark. She stood on this mark very firmly, and as I placed the white cap over her head, she said in her very languid voice, schnell, meaning quickly. The drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes, the body was taken down and was placed in a coffin, ready for burial. Irma Grazer was executed second behind Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann was executed last of the 3 women before the male executions took place. Regarding prison sentences, there were a collection of female guards who were given varying degrees of time behind bars. Herta Ellert, who was brutal and ruthless inside the concentration camps, was given the longest sentence of 15 years, which was later commuted to 12 years. She was described as immensely obese, sly, vicious in character, and an absolute master in using the whip. She was the overseer in charge of the kitchen. Through a small window she would spy on the Jewish women who were at work peeling potatoes or onions, washing dishes or doing other necessary chores in the kitchen. Once Ellert even ordered the women who were at work to undress completely. After they'd stripped, Ellert searched each one extremely thoroughly, looking no doubt for rings, money, wristwatches, and other valuables. She remained at her job until the final liquidation of the Plaszow camp. She too was on the death march when the time came for us to retreat along with the Germans. Sentenced to 10 years imprisonment was Ilse Forster, Herta Bofer, Irene Haschka, Gertrude Sauer, and Anna Hempel. Now these women were actually released in 1951, but there was debatable evidence in which Herta Bofer could have been condemned to death. She was known to have murdered prisoners with her own hands, but the evidence about this was debated. One former prisoner stated, "I saw several very weak prisoners carrying a food container from the kitchen block. As it was filled, it was very heavy. The women could not stand the weight and put it down to rest. At that moment I saw Bofer shoot at the 2 prisoners with her pistol. They fell down, but I cannot say if they were dead or wounded, but as they were very weak, thin and undernourished, I have no doubt that they died. Gertrude Feist, Frieda Volta and Hilda Vlissewitz were given lesser prison sentences. Much of the severity of the sentences centred around the evidence that emerged at trial for them. Those women who were acquitted were later, following the trial, free to live the rest of their lives however they wanted. It's not entirely clear what happened to them in the days after and how they lived their lives, but presumably, as many were young women, they later married. Some would have probably moved to different countries, but they probably wanted to live very quietly. Some female guards would even later be brought to different trials after the war, but many remained ardent Nazis. For example, Herta Bofer, the woman referred to as the sadist of Stutthof, would remain unrepentant for the rest of her days, and she later stated in an interview, I quote, "Did I make a mistake? No. The mistake was that it was a concentration camp, but I had to go to it. Otherwise, I would have been put into it myself. That was my mistake." The women who were arrested inside of Bergen-Belsen Concentration Camp were ardent Nazis who were not fearful of capture, and they stayed at the camp despite the fact they were told they could leave. They wanted to, shockingly, maintain law and order, but they were power hungry, and they wanted to remain in a place where 13,000 corpses lay all over the camp. They had different fates following the Second World War, and free women paid the ultimate price. Many of the women had not been at Belsen long, as they arrived on prisoner transports and death marches from other camps, but they helped to contribute to the horrific slaughter and deaths of the camp, and they did not improve conditions. But many of the women seemingly got away with their crimes at the end of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.